What do you do when God gives you a promise, but years pass and nothing happens? What do you do when heaven becomes silent? When prayers feel unanswered? When the dream God showed you seems further away than ever before? Joseph knew that silence. Abraham knew that silence. David knew that silence. Even Job knew that silence. The truth is, between every promise of God and its fulfillment, there is always a waiting season. And many believers today fail, not because God did not speak, but because they could not survive the silence. Tonight, we will walk through the hidden lessons of waiting, the lessons Joseph learned when God seemed quiet. Lessons that can protect your faith, strengthen your patience, and prepare you for the moment when God finally says, "Now is the time." Joseph was not an ordinary young man. He was the son of Jacob, a man who feared God deeply. Joseph grew up in a home where the stories of God's power were often told. He heard about his grandfather Isaac and his great-grandfather Abraham. He knew that God was a God of promises. But one night, when Joseph was still very young, something happened that would change the course of his life forever. Joseph had a dream. In that dream, he saw something strange. He saw sheaves of grain in a field. His sheaf stood upright, while the sheaves of his brothers bowed down before it. Joseph woke up with excitement in his heart. He did not fully understand the dream, but something deep inside him told him that God was speaking. So Joseph did what many young people do when they are excited. He told his brothers, "My brothers," Joseph said, "listen to the dream I had." But instead of celebrating with him, his brothers looked at him with anger. "Do you mean that you will rule over us?" they said. From that moment, something changed in their hearts. Jealousy was born. And Joseph did not yet know it, but the dream God gave him would begin a long journey of pain, betrayal, and waiting. When God's promise creates problems, many believers think that when God speaks, life will immediately become easier. But the Bible often shows the opposite. Sometimes, the moment God speaks, the battle begins. Joseph received the dream, but immediately his brothers began to hate him. The Bible says in Genesis 37:5, Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. Instead of honor, Joseph received hatred. Instead of support, Joseph received rejection. This is one of the first lessons believers must understand. When God gives you a promise, not everyone around you will celebrate it. Some people will misunderstand you. Some will doubt you. Some may even fight against what God has spoken over your life. But the promise of God does not depend on people's approval. The first test, betrayal. One day Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers who were taking care of the sheep far away from home. Joseph obeyed his father and went to find them. But when his brothers saw him coming from a distance, something dark entered their hearts. "Look," they said, "here comes the dreamer." And suddenly they began to plan something terrible. "Let us kill him," one of them said. "Then we will see what becomes of his dreams." Joseph did not know that while he was walking toward them in love, they were planning evil against him. But God was still watching. One brother, named Reuben, stopped them from killing Joseph. Instead, they threw him into a deep pit. Imagine that moment. Joseph had done nothing wrong, yet suddenly he found himself alone in a dark pit, abandoned by the very people who should have protected him. How confusing that must have been. "God, you gave me a dream. So why am I here?" Many believers know this moment. You prayed. You believed. You received a promise. But suddenly, life throws you into a pit, and heaven becomes silent. The second test, slavery. Joseph's brothers later sold him to traveling traders. These traders took Joseph all the way to Egypt. He was no longer a son in his father's house. He was now a slave in a foreign land. Think about that. The boy who had dreams of greatness was now cleaning floors in someone else's house. This is where many believers would have lost faith. But Joseph did something powerful. He remained faithful to God. The Bible says, in Genesis 39:2, "The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered." Notice something important. Joseph was a slave, but God was still with him. This is another powerful lesson. God's presence is not only with you in success, God is also with you in the process. The third test, false accusation. Joseph worked faithfully in the house of a man named Potiphar. Potiphar trusted him so much that he placed him in charge of everything in his house. But one day, another test came. Potiphar's wife tried to tempt Joseph. She wanted him to sin with her, but Joseph refused. He said something very powerful. "How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Genesis 39:9. Joseph understood something many people forget. Even while waiting, your character still matters. Even when the promise is delayed, your obedience still matters. But because Joseph refused her, she became angry and lied about him. Joseph was accused of something he never did. And once again, Joseph was thrown into prison. Imagine that. First the pit, then slavery, now prison. And still, the dream had not come to pass. When God seemed silent years passed, Joseph was in prison. No dream was happening. No promotion was coming. Heaven seemed quiet. This is where many believers struggle, because we expect God to act quickly. But the Bible shows that God often works slowly to prepare us. Look at Abraham. God promised him a son, but Abraham waited 25 years before Isaac was born. Look at David. God anointed him king when he was young, but he waited many years while Saul hunted him like an animal. Look at Job. He lost everything. For a long time, God seemed silent. Yet in the end, Job testified of God's faithfulness. The Bible says in Isaiah 40:31, "But those who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength." Waiting is not punishment. Waiting is preparation. What God is doing while you wait. While Joseph was in prison, something important was happening. God was shaping his character. God was teaching him humility. God was preparing him for leadership, because the palace requires a prepared heart. If God had placed Joseph in power too early, pride might have destroyed him. So the waiting season was not wasted. It was training. What believers must do while waiting. The waiting season is not a time to complain. It is a time to grow. Here are things believers must do while waiting for God's promise. 1. Remain faithful. Joseph remained faithful wherever he was placed. Whether in slavery or prison, he worked with excellence. 2. Keep trusting God. Even when circumstances look bad, trust that God is still working. Romans 8:28. All things work together for good to those who love God. 3. Guard your heart. Bitterness can destroy your destiny. Joseph forgave his brothers even after everything they did. 4. Continue serving. Waiting is not inactivity. Joseph continued serving others, even in prison. The day everything changed. One morning in prison, something unusual happened. Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, had troubling dreams. None of his wise men could explain them. But someone remembered Joseph. And suddenly, after years of silence, Joseph was called out of prison. In a single day, everything changed. Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dream, and Pharaoh made Joseph the second most powerful man in Egypt. The dream that once caused jealousy had finally come to pass. The final lesson. When Joseph finally saw his brothers again, he did not seek revenge. Instead, he said something powerful. In Genesis 50:20, Joseph said, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Joseph understood the truth. The pit had a purpose. The slavery had a purpose. The prison had a purpose. The silence had a purpose. And the same is true for believers today. Sometimes God is not saying no. Sometimes God is saying, "Wait, I am preparing something greater than you can see." Like and subscribe on this channel. If you have learnt something today, put it down on the comments section. God knows you, He loves you, and has something for you. See you on the next one.